The gift that keeps on giving. David Hogg recently tweeted this, quote, "It's crazy Texas sees porn as a greater threat to public health than the AR-15 used in Uvalde." And on its face, somebody might wonder, how is it that a person is comparing guns to pornography? Like, how are these two things even on an equivocal scale? One has to do with the exploitation of women and the trafficking of human bodies, and the other one has to do with the use of force and violence. But these two subjects alone have a long connection. In fact, you might even go back into Greek mythology, and where Ares, the god of war, steals the god of love and sex from the god of work. And if I think it's the names are Ares. What it's like? There's this interesting relationship between Ares, Hephaestus, and it's not Persephone, it might be Persephone, but it doesn't matter, because even the ancient Greeks had an attunement to understanding how these things fit with one another. Another example in more recent literature would be Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, in his book on combat, talks about how both war and sex are intimate actions. And the question, the issue, why, and I think another example of how this is relevant in today's age, in what we're talking about today at all, can be seen in another, let's just call it tweet. But Phoenix Ammunition makes a comment on how it's today. This would be today is the 19th, whatever. We're recording ahead of time, but Phoenix Ammunition makes a comment on Twitter saying, allowed advertising on Twitter dash AI art generators making weird pedo-type pornographic material or weird pedo-type porn. Not allowed to pay for Twitter ads, which are companies who produce a product that's specifically protected by our Constitution. Come on, Elon Musk. And this is this common type of issue is actually so prevalent in our world. And one might even say, which way, Western man? Are you going to go the direction of the father who trains his children on how to use a firearm, not only for their self-defense, but so that they might take care of their community and bear responsibility for their surroundings? Or are you going to go the way of the degenerate living alone in a basement or in a creepy, situation, consistently addicted to something like porn? But the problem, and I want to go a little bit deeper here, and I don't think we're just going to be able to choose innocent right versus convicted left. In fact, I want to go back to the action hero of the 2000s. There's a movie called Shoot 'Em Up featuring Clive Owen and Monica Bellucci that came out in 2007. And this movie was indicative of the action hero films of that time, which seem both like yesterday and very, very long ago. This was a time before the Marvel franchise blew up. And so in the story here, the trope of, not the trope, but the story of Shoot 'Em Up follows the actions of one hero, Clive Owen. He's probably more of an anti-hero, but I digress. Who eats carrots and is very good at shooting guns. And Clive Owen is a rogue with a heart of gold who's looking after a baby, and as a result, he befriends or starts working with or has some sort of historical relationship with a prostitute who's played by Monica Bellucci. And so here you have the juxtaposition of a woman who sells her body for money being portrayed as the loving mother character, looking after the loving and motherly character and the companion to our action hero, Steve Bellucci. Or I'm sorry, Steve, played by Clive Owen. Named Steve Bellucci, geez. And so the issue here, though, is that this is a trope, and this trope can be found in film and video games and movies and books. And in the action hero genre, you oftentimes have your obligatory sex scene, which is as close to pornographic as it can get. Depending, and it might even be seen as a bellwether for what is culturally acceptable at the time. How willing are people to push the envelope and yet still try to make money? Because remember, film is still a capitalist enterprise with the intention of making money. And so if it's too much, as almost what Game of Thrones encountered at some point in time, then it might be rejected. But there's another example of this trope, and I've seen it most often in video games, particularly games like Final Fantasy 16, The Witcher, or that sort of medieval fantasy world. And you'll have a town or a village or a city where the politicians and the leadership, oftentimes the clergy or the religious leaders, turn out to be evil and cultish and ridiculous. And they have some sort of strong stranglehold over the guardsmen of the town. And these people are all predicted or projected or presented as some sort of evil, and their counterpart is the noble madame who runs the brothel. And in this trope, this story, this kind of narrative tool that's used over and over and over again, so much that I think it's just old, and not only old and tired, but actually incorrect and immoral in a sense, is this idea that you can juxtapose the people who are supposed to be the good guys, the people who are supposed to be the leaders of the faith and the protectors of the community, have actually become corrupted. And so now the heart of moral foundation and the moral response and the kind of rebellion against the evil empire is born in the bed, in the prostitute's bed. Use that, take that feather and put it in your cap. But it's oftentimes portrayed that the madame or the leader of this prostitute house, I think that it was also prevalent in, what is the TV show Serenity, so space cowboys and stuff like that. I mean, the American cowboy concept, right? It's the drifter comes in and the prostitute is actually a prostitute with a heart of gold thing. It's a very American Western trope, and you can probably follow it back a lot further than we'd be comfortable with for our own heritage. The people who we call the greatest generation produced or magnified the stripper with a heart of gold trope, just in a different format. But in today's day and age, it oftentimes takes place in the world of the video game, where, again, the madame, the leader of the prostitutes, happens to be the good counterpart to the evil quote-unquote moral leaders or religious leaders, and you have this super generic environment upon which the story can unfold. Now, the problem with this trope is it is more fantasy than reality. In fact, if you go anywhere in the world today where you find prostitution that is legal, with exceptions that I think are so categorically outlandish that they're hiding something, with there being no reasonable exception to the rule. Wherever you find prostitution, you find brothels, you find human exploitation, you find human trafficking, you find the abuse of people, and then you find a lot of evil. In fact, the weird thing is that in a game like Final Fantasy 16, you have a strong male lead who has a soft but supportive female supporting character with him, but yet still they have to shoehorn in these odd tropes of like the noble madame and the noble brothel in rebellion against the evil empire. And it doesn't actually stick well with the story. It feels very ham-fisted. And that's because in the world that we live in today, when you look at companies like Pornhub, who are one of the largest companies, which is owned by and part of the largest conglomerate of pornographic material being produced today, the owners of the company and the leadership and the people who work for the company are well aware that their platform, so to speak, is being used in the exploitation of not only unwanted sex, in other words, rape, but also the distribution of child pornography. And just so you know, like, if this is going to be one of those episodes that if we want it to get out, I'm going to need you to share it with other people, because we're talking about guns and porn. All the algorithms are going to hate it, but wait, that is the perfect segue, because if you look at social media today, and part of the motivation for publishing this and even putting it together is not only the commentary by David Hogg himself, but also the whatever the algorithm is and whatever the people who are behind Meta seem to be entirely okay with limiting somebody's reach when it comes to firearms and education content, with exceptions which are questionable and morally dubious. But you're allowed to. But they're going to restrict your access and the ability for a person like us, like Redacted, or even Warrior Poet Society, and this has been talked about multiple times, to distribute their material. But I can tell you right now, if I look at my feed, if I do look at the For You or the Discover You page, every single reel is going to be softcore porn right now. And that is because I'm pretty sure a new algorithm or some sort of update came out, or there was some sort of reset by Meta or something that has to change, because I can tell you that's exactly what happens. Every once in a while, out of the blue, my feed will just get flooded with near pornographic or even pornographic material. And one of the most recent examples of it was like the breastfeeding trope, where you would have an OnlyFans model holding a fake child like a doll, and then they would use that as an opportunity to show off their endowments as an ad for their private page, where you can spend money to look at people who exploit you for, yeah. So let's talk about exploitation. The comparison of firearms themselves and the access to firearms to the access to porn, because what is going on in the state of Texas is that they are the 7th state that has required the content or websites that distribute adult material to verify the age of users. And as a result, the company that is owned by, or that the company that owns Pornhub, and Pornhub, which is the largest pornographic website in the world right now, very oftentimes being one of the most viewed websites in the world at all. They're in the top 10. Think about that for a minute. Take that feather, put that in your pipe and smoke it. Is that the company that produces this pornographic material decided that they would rather just not distribute in the state of Texas. Now, think about that real quick. The state says in order for you to distribute adult material, you must verify the age of the users. And the result from the company that produces is, we will just not function in your state then. Let's see this flood across the country. But and while we might be able to apply nefarious intent to the producers of pornographic materials and use this as evidence in support of that thesis, I think it's a little bit more important to recognize that if we don't need the recent actions of the owners of Pornhub we don't need that as sufficient evidence. In fact, there is already evidence much more deeply rooted. So in the joke and following in line of David Hogg's question on Twitter, or commentary on Twitter, that he thinks it is strange that that Texas would view porn as more dangerous than access to firearms or AR-15s or whatever, which is, again, it's its own argument. What we might want to do is evaluate the morality of these two things, and then, of course, no one wants to look at that, because you have to look at how how evil our compliance is and our complacency is with the distribution of pornographic material in the United States. But I'll make an argument, though. Let's even go a layer deeper. Here's an intellectual. Here's an argument for your use. You can use this at your will. Pornographic material, by its very nature, in a modally necessary component, is exploitative, because it requires the exploitation of an individual through compulsion or through incitement, incentivization, to reveal something that is meant to be private in public. And it is exploitation because it is exploiting the qualities of the individual, namely their body or their willingness to perform certain acts, for the public. But it's exploitative in evidence through not only the fact that it involves regular use of simulated or non-simulated, non-consensual participation of those involved, but if you look at the ads too, they are also predatory in nature by the advertisements, the use of it, even the temptation. It is the use of temptation to entertain or incite an experience in the individual. It's not an advertisement, it's temptation. An advertisement informs you of the qualities of the subject, whereas the exploitative nature of pornographic material is that it is primarily used. The primary approach that it reaches its audience is through exploiting their basest desires, their human nature of sorts. but it's also exploiting the biological components that we have. It's creating dopamine hacks, and it's producing in oneself the feeling of doing something or the feeling of participation in an act that they're not participating in. And so it's exploitative of the actors, it's exploitative of the audience, and it's exploitative of the economic contributions because of, oh wait, one Jeffrey Epstein. And so here's an ad for you. I am not suicidal. That is the ad. Stay tuned for April. Uh, but it is so the idea of pornography is exploitative on all layers of analysis. The people who participated are oftentimes, if not almost always, exploited into their use. Their job is to exploit the basest human natures of the audience, and people who participate in it are exploited against because of things like blackmail. Jeffrey Epstein. Need I go on? Whereas the use of firearms is not exploitative, it's amoral. The use of violence is contextually defined by the environment with it's in. Now, it might be more appropriate to compare the use of force to sex itself, where sex has appropriate times. Maybe it's in the bedroom between a husband and wife, under the confines of marriage, whereas violence has moral constraints too. The enforcement of justice and the defense of the innocents, whereas pornography, though, is by nature not that. By nature, pornography cannot be compared to violence alone because it is, by definition, the corruption of something that is sacred. It is the making public of that which is supposed to be private. It is treating the sacred as if it is profane. And it exploits the base nature of people to not necessarily meddle in other affairs, but to essentially, what is it? How would you say it, even in a funny way? There's the Ten Commandments. One of the Ten Commandments is do not envy your neighbor's wife. Take that, and that like, what else? How else could you describe pornography as envying a neighbor's wife or lusting over her? Even if it's not a wife, it's even not your neighbor. I mean, we are all now digital neighbors with less than 6 points of six degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, and so on and so forth. But I think this goes further, and I think this is an important subject to consider because it is as uncomfortable as we are. We seem to be politically faced with two options. Again, it goes back to the start. Which way, Western man, are you going to live in a world where you have the exploitation of children being used in, or the exploitation of people being used in pornographic material, or you can have access to firearms? I mean, I think, in a sense, David Hogg has said the quiet part out loud. You will have no way of defending yourself, but you should be able to be addicted to this kind of material. And before we get too far into maybe more intellectually honest arguments, I'll just jump the shark and be willingly participating in an ad hominem. Well, no, not an ad. Maybe not. It's not an ad hominem. I don't want to argue against. I'll leave that for later. It's funny because David Hogg was given a opportunity to go to Harvard on the basis that he skipped school the day that his friends were killed. So-called friends were killed at a school, and he was given an opportunity to get a degree at Harvard, where the president of the school recently had to step down while still getting paid $900,000 a year, by the way, as the president of the school, in order to because she was found out to be a plagiarist, a gross plagiarist, but also because she did an anti-Semitism in public. And I think this is a case of it would have gone on this is a case where the response to it was actually very simple in the sense of people got angry that she got found out for being a terrible person, but that's normal. That is the regular operation of people who commit these kinds of crimes. In fact, you would not be surprised how often is it the case that somebody who's caught doing something wrong responds in anger and violence. That is another example of human nature. But we have three examples of this, and then one of them would be why is it the case that social media that I have to actively work on social media to find productive content for training and gun culture and maybe even to some extent homesteading, but that's a little bit that's a different case in point entirely. But when I'm talking about moral arguments and strong character developing arguments regarding use of force and character development, why do I have to put active work to find that? But I also have to put active work to shut down pornographic material being portrayed to me on social media. What is going on at Meta where your algorithm is your algorithm being so exploited by malicious OnlyFans girls, or are you complicit in the distribution of this material? I think that would be a moral question worth considering. Is Meta morally responsible for the distribution of the material that takes place on their platform, or are they just incompetent and being taken advantage of by more skilled technological wizards, particularly that of OnlyFans girls, who typically are found to have room temperature IQ? Is that the case? And if that is the case, then what is the right action? Now this is me jumping around a bunch, and this is me treating a whole bunch of content and issues in consecutive nature. But I think there's room to understand that this is even a little bit more nefarious. Particularly for let's use this example though. So Texas is one state amongst 7 states who have required there to be age verification for users of pornographic websites. They've decided this. Adult content of that sort requires adult verification. If you go to any firearms manufacturer right now, you could look at like Palmetto State Armory, or you go to JK Armament, you go to all these. What do they get? They have a pop-up that says, "Are you 18 years or older?" Which is funny that gun firearms manufacturers are ahead of the game where they're asking the audience. I mean, this is not technically age verification, but you get the point. The age verification that pornographic websites are using are requiring you to use some form of ID, which is funny because, again, what are you doing? What is David Hogg doing? He's defending porn access for kids. And I don't think that's a stretch. I think that's exactly what's going on here. But and one might argue the effectiveness and the validity of the regulation. I don't think it's a First Amendment argument whatsoever. I think that's a red herring entirely. That you have a right to, you might have a right to. The enforcement of it is different than the right in itself, and I don't believe that a person has a right to produce pornographic material and distribute it to minors. I think that's the issue, is that I don't have a right to distribute pornographic material to minors. That is not a Second Amendment, or that is not a First Amendment issue. That is something completely different. That is actually a major moral problem. But you have a scenario, you have something like a father who has children, which by definition father has children. But you could imagine a scenario where a father is concerned with 2 things. He's teaching his son or his daughter how to shoot, and he's concerned that his son might fall prey to pornographic material, or his daughter might fall prey to being exploited in that way. And yet somehow, and I think this has a lot to do with why fathers are so important in the family, because this is often something that a father provides for his children, the compassion for his son and daughter, to teach them how to take care of themselves and live in this world where there are real dangers, but also to teach them how to be moral. And yet, in order for there to be a father is what you'd call a part of the nuclear family. And now you have activist movements like Black Lives Matter as one chief example, who their funding led to the LGBTQ thing, which produces, which uses activism to argue in support of distributing pornographic material to children in public education. It's funny that people might say that that's a disputable fact, but it really isn't. The best thing that you can say is not my teacher, not my school. But the reality is, and I'd have to ask the question, is if you're public schooling your children, do you really know that? Or is that just a cope? Is that really just a cope? Now, and this is why I think there's an argument to be made here having to do with morality. And this is like the 4th time I've recorded this episode, because I think the nuances of it are so extreme. And so I'll give you my thesis, and then I'm going to tell you a personal story. So the thesis goes like this: because So the idea of sex has to do with the creation of life, and the act of violence can include and involves the ending of life. They both fall under the moral doctrine that has to do with where do we understand the value of life, and this is why you will never be able to separate guns, pornography, abortion, and and marriage in the family. You will never be able to separate these things. You cannot have these moral arguments for the defense of life without understanding where the value of life comes from. And in order for to have the value of life, then you'll be essentially required to condemn the use of pornographic material. Whether or not that condemnation comes through the enforcement of government is an entirely different question, but we're talking about moral philosophy here. That the idea and what we find in what drives people to take up a sword and learn how to use it is that they desire to defend human life. Now, there are people who desire to do harm to others, but oftentimes it comes out of vengeance pacts or something of that sort. Whereas the most common use of firearms in the United States is things like concealed carry and self-defense. And there are exploitations in certain communities those are the kind of communities where if you find the rampant immoral use of, let's just say, violence, you very oftentimes find the same promotion or acceptance of that sort of promiscuity. These two things go hand in hand because they both deal with questions of where do we find the moral value of the individual. Now, if you understand that the value of an individual is because they are created in the image of God, then you recognize that rights do not come from the government, and that the right for a person to defend themselves supersedes the authority of a government to restrain or constrict those things. And this is why these two things get attached. It's that the use of pornographic material even then causes harm to both the user and the producer, and itself is exploitative in the ways that we see with one Jeffrey Epstein. Again, ad plug, I am not suicidal. Ad over. But I think the weight of this can be described in a story, and it's just a personal story of my own. So the first time I went to war was 15 years ago, and I've seen maybe what might be considered a sort of average distribution of violence for people in my positions. I have not seen a particularly large amount, but I have seen war. I've seen war in first person. I've been there. I'm familiar with violence in that sense. And I fit the stereotype of somebody who, according to tropes, should come home and have nightmares about going to war, being in ambushes and witnessing friends die and feeling that moral injury and hopelessness. But I'll tell you that the type of nightmare that I have one nightmare that comes back every once in a while, and that nightmare is simply cheating on my wife. It's a nightmare I'm talking about a literal nightmare, sleeping nightmare, not something that happens. Which is something that I've never done, although I've had opportunities. But that nightmare, that is something that is a true nightmare. And I think pornographic material encourages and produces that nightmare, produces the content upon which that nightmare can be recreated over and over and over again. Porn has had more impact. I wonder how much we'd have to take to measure the impact of pornographic material on the family, and how many marriages it's destroyed, and how much hopelessness and male impotence and weakness it's produced. So, that being the case, I guess I have to thank David Hogg for bringing this out into the public, and that you can have your porn for children or you can have your firearms. Which way, Western man? And if this argument has been valuable to you, please share it with your friends, because I doubt that the algorithm will allow it to travel. With that being said, you can support us at redactedllc.com. Now go forth and conquer.